Hi, my name is Dr. Charles Carson. I'm Associate Professor of Musicology and Ethnomusicology at the Butler School of Music at the University of Texas at Austin, and I'm honored to once again join you as the Mike and Patty Erspemer Scholar in Residence for the Austin Opera. And this time we're going to be talking about Verdi's greatest opera, maybe? The Requiem. Now, before we begin, a couple of tips for some of us who are visiting the opera for the first time. If you're a seasoned opera goer and you know all these things, feel free to skip ahead a couple of minutes. But for newbies, one of the first questions I get is, I don't speak the language. How am I going to follow the work? Well, in this case, the work is in Latin. But don't worry, we're going to project over the screen, over the stage, we're going to project all the translations in real time. So that'll help. The other thing I get is, what do I wear? Should I wear a tuxedo? Should I wear a gown? The main thing is just be comfortable, be yourself. We want to see you there. We don't really care what you're wearing. So have fun. If you want to have a little nice dress up night, that's great. If you just want to come comfortable and ready to watch the show, we're going to welcome you either way. Some questions about etiquette. How do I behave? How do I act? It's pretty much the same as in a movie theater. Please stop texting. You remain silent. Don't talk during the performance. But other than that, just enjoy the show. You don't have to overthink the etiquette part of it. It's pretty straightforward. In terms of cost, a lot of people are concerned about cost. Well, I can just tell you that you can get the entire season of the opera for half the price of a Taylor Swift ticket. So the concert performances that you see at either the symphony or the opera or the ballet are going to be a lot cheaper than even pop music is. You can get some tickets for $20 or $30 sometimes, so don't worry about that. Where to sit? A lot of people want to sit right in the front row. They can, get the spit on their face from the singers. Hey, if that's you, I love it. I love that for you, but I prefer to sit sort of middle and maybe at the top of the mezzanine. So any of those seats are great. For me, normally I sit way up at the top in the nosebleed sections just to save as much money as I can. The setup is perfect. You can hear everything from anywhere in the room. The performers are going to make sure that even the people in the far back get the same experience as the people in the front row. So just choose a seat that fits your price point and that really is going to bring you into the performance in whatever way you want to be involved. Now, some more advanced tips. I suggest you arrive early. For performances like this, once they close the doors, they really can't let anyone in late until there's a break in the performance, and that could take a while depending on what the conductor allows. The other thing is, arriving early allows you to use the restroom, get in the line and wait through and use the restroom before the performance. Unlike some of the other operas that we may have seen, this is the concert performance of a piece that is performed without intermission. So it's about an hour and 15 minutes, no break. So you're going to want to make sure you take that break before the performance begins. Otherwise, before and after, when you're hanging out, please come talk to me. If you see me in the lobby, I'd love to talk to you, answer any questions, get your input and feedback about the performance or anything else you want to talk about. Now, the Verdi Requiem was premiered in 1874 at the Church San Marco in Milan. Now, requiem, the title of the work, comes from the Latin word rest, and specifically, it refers to a subgenre of the Roman Catholic Mass. In this case, a mass for the dead or a funeral mass for the dead. So we often just shorten it to requiem, right? It's all in Latin, like I said before, but the text, unlike many of the operas that Verdi would set in his normal part of his career, the text is set by the church, more or less. So the Mass, what we call the Mass Ordinary, the typical Mass, has a number of set sections. Some of those are retained for the Requiem, in particular the Kyrie, the Sanctus, the Agnus Dei, sections like that are preserved for the Requiem. But some of the more celebratory parts of the Mass Ordinary are pulled out because this is a more solemn occasion. So they insert stuff like the Requiem, the Introit, right? That's the introduction, that is the opening prayer for the dead. And then they also insert, most famously, the Dies Irae, which is a poem, a long form poem about the Day of Judgment. And that becomes one of the focal points for a lot of the settings of the Requiem Mass. Now, as a liturgical rite, a rite for use in church, the focus on the Requiem, the focus of Requiem is often on the text, but music has been integrated into this since at least the 7th century. And around the 14th century, they started integrating what we call polyphonic or multi voice performances and works into this. Composers have set the Requiem a lot, and it's a very popular work to set both as a liturgical work for use in church and also as a concert work. Some famous ones include the one of the oldest surviving polyphonic settings, which is the Ockeghem Requiem. Others include the Cherubini Requiem, which was very influential on Verdi when he was working on this work. One of the most famous ones you would know from the movie Amadeus would be the Mozart Requiem, which perhaps was written for himself, which was finished by one of his colleagues, Süssmayr. The Berlioz Requiem is a massive work that's very popular in the concert hall, not as popular in the church, however. Of course, our Verdi Requiem from 1874, and then some later ones like the Fauré Requiem or ones that mixed other genres. The Britain Requiem the War Requiem, integrates text about the horrors of war in sort of a plea for peace. And then, of course, there's an interesting take on the Requiem from a Protestant point of view, the Brahms German Requiem, which integrates other text and German language into this setting. So it's a very popular liturgical rite to set by composers, and there are hundreds and hundreds of settings. We're going to see one of the most famous and popular settings, the Verdi Requiem. Now, Giuseppe Verdi, the composer of the Requiem, was born in 1813 in a small town just near Parma. His early successes as an opera composer included works like the 1842 piece Nabucco, which included the massive chorus Va Pensiero, which has become sort of an official Italian national anthem. For the next 20 or so years, he worked constantly, turning out as many as 20 operas over the next 15 or 16 years in what he called his anni di genere, his galley slave years, where he was working for opera companies, just writing operas constantly, and had little power or choice over what he was supposed to be writing about, right? But in the years between 1851 and 1853, he had massive hits with three back to back smash hit operas, including stuff like Rigoletto, Il Trovatore, La Traviata. These works set him up as one of the major contemporary composers and freed him from having to do the sort of galley slave kind of work for pay. Now he was able to choose what he wanted to work on and who he wanted to work with a little bit more. He kind of retired from composing opera after his grand opera Aida in 1871. And many people thought that he had followed Rossini, who had taken an early retirement because he was so popular. But he started getting antsy, and after composing a number of smaller pieces, he turned his attention to this work in 1874, the Requiem. Now, the funny thing is this would have been the crowning achievement of anyone's career. But in his 70s, he came back out of retirement to write Otello, right, about the Shakespeare play Othello, and became one of the massive hits of his career, even that late in his career. So then he retires again. But then in his 80s, he comes out of retirement yet again to write the massive comedy super hit Falstaff, based again on Shakespeare. So even right up until the end of his life, he was pretty active and well respected. He was considered the foremost composer of Italian opera and one of the greatest living composers of his time. He was a cultural hero in Italy, especially associated with the Risorgimento, or the unification of all the Italian states that became a more or less modern Italy. So much so that his name, Verdi, became a rallying cry for unification based around Victor Emmanuel, Re d'Italia, the person that they were sort of rallying around, Victor Emmanuel, to become the leader of the Risorgimento. So his name was a rallying cry. As a person, he could be quite ornery and a little bit of an old man who didn't like some of the new trends going on. But he was really interesting in that he was very anti-clerical. He didn't really have a lot of trust in church and the church power. He was also very liberal, especially as the unification movement started to get steam. He became a person at the center of that, even though he kind of eschewed politics himself. He was happy to be used as a symbol for that kind of thing that he believed in terms of nationalism in Italy. When he died in 1901, as many as 300,000 people attended his service. It was a massive event where, again, an orchestra and a choir of over 800 people joined together in singing, again, his unofficial national anthem, Va Pensiero. So this is a person who became central to the idea of what modern Italy would be, and works such as the Requiem stand up as one of his great masterpieces. Now, Verdi composed the Requiem in memory of his colleague Alessandro Manzoni, and sometimes we call it the Manzoni Requiem because of that. Manzoni was a writer, a thinker, and a cultural leader throughout the Risorgimento, the Italian unification movement. And he became a cultural hero to people like Verdi. And his death spurred Verdi to write a work to commemorate his contributions to Italian nationalism. But the actual origins of Verdi's Requiem in terms of music lies in the death of Rossini. Rossini was one of Verdi's other cultural heroes, this time in music. And after Rossini died, Verdi organized a group of his contemporary Italian composers to collectively compose a requiem in honor of Rossini. That never came to fruition because mostly because Verdi was very, very strict about how it could happen. But eventually, Verdi took that section of the Rossini requiem that never happened and built the Manzoni requiem around it. So you could say that this requiem, as it is honoring both Rossini and Manzoni, is more than a requiem for these individuals. It's a requiem for the Risorgimento itself. It's a requiem for the hopes and dreams of this Italian nation that Verdi loved so much. In that way, it's as much a political or a public ritual as it is a sacred one. And we could say that this is in keeping with Verdi's own ideas about the government and the church, pushing back against the control, the clerical control and the government control, and instead focusing in on great artists and thinkers who he believed were actually the heart and soul of this new nation. Now, some controversy does surround this work, and namely, it's the idea of, is this an opera? Is it not? What is it? And to be fair, there's a little bit of both in this. One of the critics of the time said it was opera in church clothes. So you can imagine opera dressing up in its Sunday best and heading off to the cathedral. As a joke, a lot of us call it Verdi's greatest opera? Question mark. But critics, well, they may have criticized whether or not it's a sound liturgical, as in functional church work. No one's really criticized it as a powerful and profound sacred statement in art. So it's both sacred, liturgical, functional, and dramatic, but it is not narrative. It doesn't have a story. So you might compare this to something like an oratorio, which is sort of an unstaged opera about a sacred topic. A famous example of this would be Handel's Messiah. It has sacred elements, but it is not necessarily appropriate for use in church, right? Today, however, the work is considered a masterpiece, although really questions of genre still remain. So now let's turn to the music and what we're actually here to talk about. The work, the Requiem, is set and broken into 7 sections, lining up with the sort of big sections of the Requiem Mass. Now, some of those sections are broken into smaller subsections. And he writes each section for some combination of soloists or ensemble singers and chorus and orchestra. So there's a varied combination depending on each section and movement of the sections. Some sections are a cappella, meaning it's just the chorus singing by themselves with no instrumental accompaniment, which of course nods back towards the style of church music that we're referring to. But others utilize, the orchestra as a kind of character itself, right, which is a very operatic approach. So the orchestra often has information for us and tells us how we should think or feel about something that's happening musically in the vocal line. So that's a really interesting use of music, and it's something that's part of his style and that he helped to develop in the opera world too. Soloists, like I said, step in and out of viewpoints and different points of view. So sometimes they're suggesting that they are the character singing in the first person, and other times they're more of a narrator and they don't interact with the orchestra, with the music around them in any significant way. He uses moments of music paintings, or you hear like sort of thunder and lightning, or text painting, where you hear the singers using words with the music describing sort of how that should feel. There's a great example in the More Stupebit section where the bass sings "Wars, wars, wars," sort of falls down this idea of death, sort of falling and the life draining out of the deceased kind of thing. So it's a very dramatic, almost operatic example of that. So this is why we say that this work sets at the nexus of three genres of music. We have sacred music, and again, thinking about liturgical music, music that's used for a sacred function. So that's one section. That's one way of thinking about it. Another way to think about it would be dramatic music, or music that is theatrical. Even if it doesn't have a story or a narrative, it's still very theatrical. So dramatic would be the second category. The third category would be absolute music, is a term we use in music and musicology to describe sort of concert music or symphonic music, music that stands on its own, like a Beethoven symphony. It may not have a story, but it unfolds according to the logic of the musical design and development of the piece itself. So between sacred, dramatic, and absolute, Verdi blends all three of these into a massive work that feels very real and approachable and organic, and never falls into one or other category too much, but instead uses all of them to heighten the effect of the work. And I think that's really the genius of the work. So those who know me know that I like to offer a few key moments, places that you can sort of hold on to help orient yourself through a work this long. And the first key moment I want to look at is from the opening of the work, from the opening section, the introit, the Requiem Kyrie section. And I want to look at the entrance moment, the moment of the Kyrie, right? And the Kyrie is an example of what we might think of as the absolute music approach. The structure is something that follows by the musical ideas, not the text or any kind of plot, which doesn't exist in the Requiem anyway. Instead, Verdi introduces musical ideas and develops them, again, in a sort of symphonic kind of approach, right? There's not a lot of text to the Kyrie section. Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, Kyrie eleison. Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. That's all. So that frees him up to do a lot of musical work. In this case, he uses imitative counterpoint where voices enter one after another, sort of mimicking what the last one said. Again, a nod towards the church music approach of this. But at the same time, each one of these entrances is slightly different. So there's a development that happens, again, more of a symphonic approach. Voices enter one at a time. You have tenor, then you have the bass, then you have the soprano and the mezzo soprano in sort of a terrace, sort of stair step kind of a thing. And that enables you to hear the different registers and their entrances so that you can hear the musical development. So it progresses through thinking about the music itself, the sound of the notes itself, as the thing to focus on, because you've already gotten the text as soon as you hear that opening sort of chant of Kyrie. You know the rest of it because it's a very short text, right? This comes just after the opening section of the Requiem proper, Requiem Aeternam, which evokes a very traditional type of approach. So if you have this traditional church style approach being interrupted by what is more an absolute music or a symphonic approach, this contrast tells you immediately that this is going to be a very unique setting of a Requiem. Now, the second key moment I want to talk about is what we call the tuba mirum section. And this is taken from the second large section of the Requiem, the Dies Irae. Now, the Dies Irae is one of the most famous and powerful parts of the Requiem. And unlike other sections of the Requiem that are set sort of to liturgical texts, this is set to a poetic text and poetic stanza. And that the imagery and the drama and the structure of what's happening, depictions of the day of judgment, are very, very, very seductive to composers. They love to set this section and do crazy things with it. The earliest chant version of this, right, is even famous. It's been used in songs and even in a symphony in one case. You know the work, Dies irae, dies illa, right? That piece, that's the setting of the same text. And we that's become famous. Now, we know it from more contemporary settings of famous settings by composers like Mozart. Or Berlioz. and of course, the Verdi example that we're talking about here. Now, the Dies Irae is an example of the dramatic approach. It's dramatic, it's theatrical, it's non narrative, but it does use sort of moving between first and third person perspectives in various ways. The soloist will often step in the first person and talk about their experiences and their feelings in this moment, while you have the chorus interjecting a third person narrative kind of a point of view that describes what's going on during this day of judgment. And the section that we're going to be listening to now, the Tuba Mirum, refers to the trumpet's wondrous sound. And it refers to the idea of the trumpet sounding the beginning of the day of judgment. And tuba is the Latin root for the word trumpet, right? So in this case, well, Verdi is going to depict a lot of sounds of like offstage trumpets and offstage fanfares that are depicting the day of judgment beginning as the sort of souls begin to rise. This setting is obviously heavily indebted to the Berlioz setting of the Dies Irae, in which Berlioz uses as many as 4 offstage brass choirs and 15 or 16 timpani, to show this day of judgment, day of wrath. But where the Berlioz setting is more about awe, it's about overwhelming the listener with this massive sound filling the hall. The Verdi setting is really more about instilling terror and inflicting terror in the listener so that you understand the power and the depth of this day of judgment. Now, the final key moment I want us to look at is the Libera Me. And this is the section that he originally composed for the Rossini Requiem, but a little bit reworked to be included here. This is, strictly speaking, not a section of the Requiem Mass. Instead, it's something that's normally said at the gravesite after the service. But Verdi wanted to include it as the closing to have this moment of sort of reflection for everyone there as the sort of the body is lowered into the ground metaphorically, right? The text, Deliver Me, O Lord, from eternal death, is really a pleading from the first person, and that's something he's going to exploit a lot. It brings together the sort of sacred, the dramatic, and the absolute into one work here at the end of the piece. In particular, the sacred you see in the use of a cappella vocal writing during this section, where the choir is just singing by itself in, as we say, the chapel style, right, a cappella. And this will be intermixed with a declamatory style of singing in the soprano soloist that sounds a lot like intoning in the church, da, 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 like on one note, right? So it's evoking the sort of liturgical ritual there. Now, from a dramatic point of view, there is the moment of what we might describe as sort of parlando or talky singing, which is as close as Verdi's going to get to the sort of operatic recitative that he would normally use. This is a very rare moment in this opera that he does this type of thing. And in this case, this is the moment where the soprano soloist is playing the character, where she's saying, deliver me, right? Deliver me first person. And she's pleading directly, right? So this is a very dramatic and theatrical moment. But at the same time, you have moments of absolute music, sort of the symphonic kind of approach, the musical, strictly musical approach blended into this too, especially the large fugue that is the heart of the ending section of the entire work, where the chorus and the soprano soloists layer on top of each other over and over again in these sort of imitative sort of stacks of sort of purely musical development. Because the text has already been stated very clearly and we know the text, so repeating it over and over again doesn't move us forward in terms of what's happening, but the musical development is carrying us into that section. And this is a very, very powerful moment. And he brings all of this together in the closing moments of the work And I think intentionally to highlight the humanity of this piece, that the piece is about the human experience and dealing specifically with the uncertainty of what happens next. Now, ultimately, what is the place of this work? Is it an opera? Is it a sacred work? Like I said, it's a little bit of both. And we really need to understand that Verdi's stated anti clerical stance has clouded the reception and our understanding of the work. Verdi was always very cagey about his own specific religious convictions. Some people said he was a borderline atheist. Some people said he definitely wasn't a believer. He just wasn't, but he wasn't fully atheist. Either way, we know he was very open and public in questioning the power of the church. And like many of his operas, the focus in this work is ultimately on people, on humans. And the work doesn't promise redemption or anything for the deceased. It actually ends on the plea, libera me, deliver me. It ends on the question, which ultimately in the work is unanswered. And viewed from a certain point of view, this is really not about the divine, but it's about the human. It is a work that is intimately connected with the question of humanity, and perhaps um, factoring in Verdi's own religious beliefs. It's the composer himself asking to someone, to anyone, to the universe, what in fact comes next. And I think that makes this not so much a religious work, but more of a universal. Now, we at the Austin Opera have a great performance planned. We have some great soloists, some very good friends of mine are going to be on stage for this performance. So I'm really excited for this, and I hope you enjoy it too. I would also caution you to go ahead and start getting your Madame Butterfly tickets because those things are going pretty fast. That's the next production. If you see me at the performance, you see me in the hall, please again come up and talk to me. I'm happy to meet all of you. Again, answer any questions or just see what you thought about the performance. That's a big part of this job, and it's something I really love to do. I really hope to see you there at our performance of Verdi's greatest opera.
Excuse me, is there a doctor in the house?